How are we, folks? So the government has now announced that prisoners are going to lose their rights to vote again. I love this. I personally love this. I remember when the previous Labour government decided that they're going to reintroduce some voting rights to the inmates in prisons, right? People on remand, they already have them because they're not convicted of anything, so restricting them of their right to vote would be improper. However, people who are sentenced, well, they weren't able to vote, and Labour took issue with that. Well, it seemed that they took issue with that, but they didn't really apply their logic very consistently, and I'll explain that. So essentially what the Labour government did, I believe, it was either just before the 2020 election or shortly thereafter, they looked at the voting laws, and this is something that National had fiddled around with under John Key, but they looked at the voting laws for prisoners and they saw that, hey look, we want to allow prisoners who are sentenced to less than 3 years the ability to vote. Now the logic behind this was that these inmates who are sentenced to less than 3 years will be released under the next government, and so should they not have a deciding factor or some form of say in who it is that represents them when they are released. Now, on the surface, that's not the worst argument in the world. The problem is they didn't really apply this across the board. Whereas the logic makes sense for people who are going to be released into the next government, that was only for people sentenced to less than 3 years and completely ignored those with less than 3 years left on their sentence. So in this case, someone was able to be sentenced to 3 years and 6 months and have absolutely no say on who the government is, despite the fact they're already halfway through their sentence. Whereas someone who just came in, who got sentenced to 2 years and 10 months, they do get a say, even though they're actually a good chance to be released later than the person already halfway through their 3 year and 6 month sentence. I don't know what the real logic was. I just think they wanted to look like they were giving back some more rights to prisoners because it affirmed or upheld a particular narrative about them as being the party who cares about prisoners, who cares about rehabilitation, and so on. I saw just today someone say that, prisoners being able to vote is very important. It is essential to their rehabilitation and reintegration. I think that's the biggest load of nonsense I've ever heard. Nonetheless, perhaps that's the logic that Labour was really holding back then. That it's just in our best interest to show that we care about these people and we want them to have a voice again. But then I bring it back. Why was it not applied logically across the board then? Every single inmate, and National brought this up at the time, every single inmate with less than 3 years should have had their voting rights restored if that was the logic and that was the argument that you were going to put forth for as to why this law change was needed. So what is the current government doing? Well, they're basically just going to get rid of them again. And I'm all for that. I am all for the government saying, we don't want you guys voting because you gave up your right to vote when you decided to commit a crime that landed you in prison. I've seen some people say, I don't like this because, what if you can't vote against the people that put you in there? I'm like, well, you put yourself in there and you did so in accordance with the laws that you already had influence over before you committed the crime. Laws in this country are typically never retrospective. There are some cases where they are, but more often than not, they're not retrospective in any way whatsoever. So you are in prison because of laws that you already had the ability to influence. And now that you're in prison, you should not get to dictate what the government does, because you've shown that you have absolutely no regard for the laws that they created in the first place. But what has Paul Goldsmith, Justice Minister, had to say on it? Well, he said the following: restoring prisoner voting was typical of the previous government's soft on crime approach. We don't agree with it. Citizenship brings rights and responsibilities. People who breach those responsibilities to the extent that they are sentenced to jail temporarily lose some of their rights, including the right to vote. The government is committed to restoring law and order, and part of the response is to place a greater emphasis on personal responsibility and accountability. A total prison voting ban for all sentenced prisoners underlines the importance that New Zealanders afford to the rule of law and the civic responsibility that goes hand in hand with the right to participate in our democracy through voting. When prisoners have served their time, they will enjoy the full restoration of electoral rights. The Department of Corrections and the Electoral Commission currently coordinate to support prisoners with re-enrolment upon their release, and this work will continue. Me, I completely agree with all of that. And this isn't just because I'm a meanie, it's because I know how these prisoners think. The average prisoner, when this law was originally changed, 5 or 6 years ago, they were saying, "Oh, this is great. Now we can vote to get lesser sentences. Now we can vote to avoid jail next time. It's going to help our bros stay out." All of it was through the mindset of, yes, now we don't have to be held as accountable anymore. Yes, now we can commit more crime and get away with it. That was the logic. That was the mindset. These are not people that you want voting. They don't have any regard for you. They don't have any regard for the community. They don't have any regard for wider society. So I think, given that we already restrict their freedoms, restrict their rights through incarceration, any argument that this is against their rights or restricts their rights unnecessarily is just silly. Because we already do that. That's why prisons exist in the first place. Because we need to restrict some people's rights to keep others safe. That's why we have them. That's why we should maintain them. And that is why having a few other bits and bobs that are restricted is completely above board. People who are released on parole, they also often have curfews. These curfews aren't what most people have, and yet they are deemed necessary to keep their community safe and to ensure that these people are following a structure, able to follow the rules that are given to them so that we can be sure that once their parole is over, they are law-abiding citizens. This is why we have these sorts of things. Restrictions to ensure that they know that they need to be following the law of the land, and if they don't, there will be consequences.